Hello everyone, this is Tom Fox. I'm the Compliance Evangelist, and I'd like to welcome you back to another episode of the Compliance Report International Edition with yet another episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. Compliance Man Goes Global is a podcast with myself and Timur Khasanov-Batirov. Tim is a 17-year compliance practitioner who has worked in Ukraine, Russia, and other emerging markets. In Compliance Man Goes Global, we look at typical concepts, myths, or conventional wisdom on various compliance topics and see whether or not these myths, conventional wisdom, or concepts work in emerging markets as opposed to a more mature market such as the United States. Additionally, we have an illustrated series on Compliance Man that Tim has put together, which is in conjunction with each episode. Today we take a look at Know Your Client, probably the most important process in the compliance portfolio, or at least one of the most important processes. We consider that in the context of the fascinating Canterbury Tales by Geoffrey Chaucer, and this episode is entitled Compliancebury Tales. I hope you will enjoy this episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. The Compliance Report International Edition is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox, the Compliance Evangelist, back with Tim Khasanov-Batirov for another episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. Today, we are going to take a look at Compliancebury Tales, a takeoff of Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales. So with that, for those who have listened to our podcast before, you will know that we take a look at some typical concepts, possibly myths, or even conventional wisdom around compliance topics, and then we try to unpack whether or not they are concepts, myths, or conventional wisdom, but most particularly in the context of emerging markets where Tim practices. We take two concepts for each podcast, and we see how they might go really in emerging markets. Tim obviously has a wealth of experience in the Ukraine, and Russian Federation. So he's well-versed to help us understand what compliance is like once you get outside of the United States. Today we want to take a look at a couple of topics. The first is politically exposed persons, and the second is around how to look at both contracts, information leading up to contracts, business justification, and the interaction between the compliance practitioner and the business folks that you're working with. So, Tim, with that, perhaps you might want to explain why we're calling today's episode Compliancebury Tales.
Tom, thank you for having me today. And as you have already mentioned, our today's episode is called Compliancebury Tales. So we are alluding to the Canterbury Tales, a classical text of Geoffrey Chaucer, which many people heard of but never read. So this is a very close analog to our today's topic.
Well, very good, Tim. So let's just start right into it. So let's take a look at myth number one, which in practice, there is no problem with the definition of the term PEP or politically exposed persons. What are your thoughts on that statement, Tim?
Well, Tom, I would strongly disagree with this statement. I think there are huge problems with this definition. To start with, different legislations might have various definitions for a group which we traditionally call politically exposed persons. Thus, you might have a conflict of laws trying to prove that a particular person is a PEP per US definition as used in FCPA enforcements, for instance, while per local legislation outside the US, the person clearly is not considered as a politically exposed person. In addition, even if we take legislation issued by international organizations like FATF guidance or, for instance, the EU's directive, you still will have more questions than answers. In plain language, in the end of the day, you never know for sure if daughter of former justice, let's say, should be considered as a politically exposed person. What do you think, Tom?
So before I really get into some of my thoughts, there really is a question that I wanted to pose to you on this, Tim, which is that in the United States, we would view a politically exposed person as really anyone associated with a foreign government. That could be a current foreign government employee. It could be someone who's in a political party in the country. It could be a former government minister. Does a definition that is really literally that broad cause you as a compliance practitioner in an emerging market difficulty, or is that something that you are more comfortable with?
Thank you, Tom, for raising this question, because from practical perspective, you might have a problem. While these type of definitions look very fancy in the legal memo from the famous law firm, however, if you are being an in-house compliance practitioner, you never know whether this type of answer will satisfy business people. For instance, they're going to contract the company which is owned or co-owned, for instance, by, as in our example, daughter of the former justice. Maybe her father was a justice 10 years ago, but he was, or probably still, is a very powerful person. Whether he could be considered as a former politician or a politician who is still in the power, no, he is not at his position anymore. Whether we think that his daughter should be a person whom we call a politically exposed person. Because, we have just a very straightforward approach being in the corporate world, whether we can work or contract this company or not, because the risk appetite for many businesses is to avoid dealing with the companies which are controlled by the politically exposed person. So yes, we have issues considering different legislations in terms of classifying, in terms of defining certain groups of people as politically persons due to the fact that different legislation view on this matter from different perspectives.
So I certainly agree with your analysis, Tim. One thing I would add is it's becoming more significant in the United States, and I'm really going to raise this as a question because I really can't give you a solid answer yet, but that's the relationship of with a politically exposed person. In other words, a friend. And we had a very large FCPA enforcement action this summer involving Halliburton, where the local representative or the local content partner in Angola was actually a close friend of the minister who was letting the contracts. So you certainly want to have someone of influence, but when does that influence move to something really beyond the ability to get in front of someone and state your case? So many U.S. companies are now trying to look at the issue of close personal friends. And since that's not something you can tell by looking at documentation, it's certainly not going to be determined on a computer search. You may have to interview the person. If you interview them, they may or may not admit to being close personal friends. There are obviously many levels of friendship, and I think it's going to be very difficult for many companies to really figure out how to navigate this. But it really falls within the context of politically exposed persons, and even ties, I think, directly into some of your thoughts and comments on family members. I would say in the United States, most companies take a very conservative approach, meaning that they define a politically exposed person as broadly as possible and try to identify those. If they're going to do business with a politically exposed person, they recognize that has FCPA implications, and going forward, they have to manage that relationship closely. I would just end on the note that simply because someone is a politically exposed person does not necessarily mean you cannot do business with him. You just have to recognize the potential risks under whatever anti-corruption law you're following at the time. So some great points there, Tim, and I wish we could give our listeners a more definitive answer, but I think really at this point, there are lots of questions that you and I have explored that I hope will get the compliance practitioner to ask questions about their own compliance policy as well.
I fully agree with your approach, Tom. Yes.
Well, let's take a look at myth 2, because in this one, I think we actually may be able to take a fair amount of deep dive into some legal and business issues that we don't often get to speak about directly. So I think most compliance practitioners are certainly aware of KYC, which is Know Your Customer, and that includes your business partner. And I would say it's probably even more important for your business partner. So many companies will ask for such things as incorporation documents, tax certificates, online business filings, or perhaps other records, so that you truly know who you are doing business with. You take a look at several years back, a retrospective look, and that appears on its face to be an adequate KYC paper program. But it's doing business with someone is really much broader than simply knowing who you're doing business with. It's the business that you are doing business with, what you're doing business with, in other words, and how you're doing business with them. So I was wondering if you might have some thoughts about what we would call in the United States the business justification, or why you are doing business with someone. And do you find that to be an important issue in emerging markets, Tim?
I would think it's one of the most important things for the Know Your Client procedure. As you have said, sometimes companies have been collecting a lot of documents. We can call them legal documents from potential business partners, asking of plenty certificates and declarations, things like that. We often see that there is less attention to the concept of business justification. So what is business justification for the corporates? I would think that we can say that business justification is justification of business partner engagement, which could be called as a reason why the company needs particular services, along with the reason why you need the services from that particular third party. So 2 basic questions: why we need those services, and the second question, why we need those services from that particular TPI. So obviously you cannot disregard this concept, specifically operating at high-risk markets and taking in consideration FCPA enforcement practices. So this is with regard to business justification matter.
So that's certainly, I wholeheartedly agree with this. Why do you need this particular service, and why this business partner? But are there really other concepts that the compliance practitioner needs to look to the business to justify, such things as the fair market value or an economic analysis or consideration?
Yes, that's a very important concept. So why fair market value is important from practical perspective? I would think that if a company engages a third-party intermediary which interacts on its behalf with governmental authorities, the remuneration rate should be of fair market value. I strongly recommend defining FMV if Western company engages third party from emerging market. So actually we referred to Know Your Client in the Compliance Man Illustrated series, which accompanies this episode. And when we are talking about fair market value, I would like to emphasize that it's a very important thing. For example, when you are dealing with the intermediary, you want to be sure that the remuneration is actually matches the market. Because if you are paying more, you might face the risk that this intermediary might use additional money, or at least the regulator might say that, for improper purposes. That's why as a business you want to have a very transparent and trackable mechanism which demonstrates that if you are hiring a lawyer, for instance, to represent your company at the emerging market, for example, at the court, the remuneration which you pay is within the market. So that's my basic understanding of the necessity of FMV as a very important control mechanism for emerging markets.
So you really said a couple of very important things in there, Tim. And so let me maybe see if I could split them up. The first is I could not agree with you more on the business justification. But really the only thing I would add is that the compliance professional must, and I must emphasize the word must. I realize that's probably an inarticulate way to say it. But the business justification must come from the business representative, whoever that might be, for several reasons. The first of all is that the business representative is going to know what he or she needs for his business. A compliance officer or a compliance professional may not have that on-the-ground business knowledge. The second thing is that by making the business representative fill out and sign the business justification, they become the owner of that business venture partner from the compliance perspective. And so they are charged with the responsibility of communicating to that business partner your expectations around compliance. And the third is it really works to what we would say in the United States is operationalize your compliance program. You're pushing out the requirements of compliance to the business unit, to the people closest to the business, to the closest on the ground. So I think it's absolutely mandatory that you require a business representative fill out and sign the business justification. If the compliance professional does not understand it, for whatever reason, it's up to the business person to explain. If a business person can't explain to a 2-year-old why they need to do business with a business partner, they probably don't need to do business with them. So that's one thing, as you can tell, I'm pretty passionate about because I think it's so important. But the second thing you talked about, Tim, is something that is equally important, and frankly, I don't think we talk about enough, which is fair market value. It's certainly one thing for a business unit representative to make the case in writing of why they need a particular business partner to help the business moving forward. But the next level up is the compensation. Is the compensation fair for the services that they are delivering or products that they're delivering in that market? And compensation can change in markets. What is fair compensation in Texas or in the United States may be different in Ukraine or Moscow or another emerging market. So that type of analysis, once again, is absolutely critical from the business perspective. If you're going to pay someone, not only what services are they going to deliver for you, but is it a fair value to you as a company? And that's also something that should come from the business representative. I, as a compliance practitioner, may understand it, but it's not really, the burden should not be on me to make the fair market value argument. So I heartily agree with your point here, and I don't think we really talk about that enough. And I don't know how you are able to explain that in training in emerging markets, but I hope that you can really help compliance practitioners in the United States understand why fair market value is so important, why it can change from market to market, and it should be really a defined information in your business justification.
I fully agree with you, Tom, and thank you for mentioning the aspects of training people with regard to FMV. It's really important. And the good thing about the fair market value concept that it also benefits the business as well. While, for example, as we are as a compliance people want to be sure that the compensation, as you have said, is within the market. In the same time, business also wants to be sure that the remuneration is adequate and it's fair. So here, both business people and compliance are doing the same thing and have the very same goal. So with regard to that, I think that FMV is a very helpful instrument, both from the regulatory and commercial perspectives.
Well, Tim, these are both highly important, I think, practical tips, but they're also highly important legal tips. So I hope that every compliance practitioner who's listening to this, whether they're in the United States, in an emerging market, or even another market, would understand they need to incorporate the concepts of business justification and fair market value directly in, and of course politically exposed persons, directly into their compliance program. So lots to talk about in today's episode, and this has been a fascinating discussion for me. I hope that you will join us again for our next episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. And this is Tom Fox and Tim Khasanov-Batirov saying thank you for listening, and we look forward to visiting with you. Tim, thank you. Hello, everyone. This is Tom Fox again. I'd like to thank you for listening to this episode of the Compliance Report International Edition, where we took a look at yet another episode of Compliance Man Goes Global. If you have enjoyed this podcast, I would appreciate it if you would rate our podcast, as it would help in our rankings and also help get the word out about the only compliance podcast which really deals with the international aspects of doing business in compliance. Also, if you have any questions, you can email me at tfox@tfoxlaw.com. The Compliance Report International Edition is a part of the Compliance Podcast Network. I hope you will join us again soon for another episode of the Compliance Report International Edition and another episode of Compliance Man Goes Global.